Okay, let's talk some Hebrew now. What I wanted to show you is this will help a little bit to explain why the subject I'm now embarked on, which is those words holy, holiness, sanctify, sanctification. One of the reasons I tried to show, and I will review this again, is our language that has been infiltrated and has many loan words from different languages, including what, we tend to think that Latin spilled into the Germanic tongues, but actually, if you look at antiquity, you'll find that it goes both ways. The language, the Latin language, actually, as you know, it died out for a time, came back, was replaced as the lingua franca, the language, at least legally, theologically, for a time. Much like if you follow the languages, you'll find, for example, French was, in England, was the language that was used in conducting a court of law, all legal matters. Everything was done in French, which seems kind of nutty to me. So you'll eventually and inevitably have words from other languages that will be loaned, borrowed, picked up. Sometimes they stay, sometimes they don't. But the difficulty that we have, first and foremost, is we're dealing with Hebrew. When we talk about our Bible, we're dealing with Hebrew. The language itself is, as I've said, ambiguous. And now let's add to that. And I think just by a few things that I say tonight, it might help to open up to why this is a very complex subject. On my tablet here, I've quickly scribbled out here, you've got the words that are being used. These are the Hebrew words that are being used to translate holy, holiness. I haven't put them all, but they're all derivatives of that Kof, Dalid, Shin of Kadesh, Kodesh, Kadesh, Kedesh, depending on the vowel that's underneath. But these two on the top are adjectives. This particular one here, CH as an adjective, means it's common. It can go either way. This adjective, we'll find out as I open this up for you. I'm just kind of giving you an overview. Can be, as adjectives work the same way in English to describe, to help describe the noun. There's many, I should say there are more functions than we use with an adjective, but here at least we know it can be describing something. Then we have the verbal forms here, Kadesh, and it's just the vowel that you can see that changes the word. But why this is important, just even glancing at this, and I have in my lap here the Englishman's Hebrew Concordance of the Old Testament by George Wigram, which is a staple for anyone who's going to study language, Hebrew language. What's really important is if you did not study Hebrew with me, understanding the way Hebrew verbs work will shed light a little bit on part of the confusion in translation. So I don't want to fault the translators and say, oh, they were stupid. They weren't stupid. This is difficult, challenging stuff. And compound that with, if we're going to go back to look at our first really smooth English version, translation, I don't even want to look at Wycliffe's, because Wycliffe's is almost, it's very difficult to use in a modern example. But by the time you get to Tyndale, you've got a flow going in between Tyndale's version, translation of the Bible, specifically now I'm talking New Testament, but the language has changed radically in 200 some years, and then jump from Tyndale to the King James, and you can actually see the language of the King James is more refined, and we've had in that, we'll say 300 year space from Wycliffe, and forgive me, my time's a little off, but from Wycliffe to the King James, you have had development, a crystallization, a formalization of the English language. Even by the time you get to the King James, you've got words that will drop out. From the King James to the now, there are words that are archaic, we don't use anymore, or the way they are conjugated, or the way they appear are archaic, and we don't use them anymore. The Hebrew is different. The Hebrew has essentially, you've only got, it's a limited amount of options that you can go with. So as a translator, I would love, just for the purpose of this, if you put on the translator's hat and you were trying to convey, without bias, the truest sense of the text, it would be very difficult, even with the Hebrew verbs, because the Hebrew verbs will tell you something. They will, in the call, for example, is a simple action. If you remember in the PL, which is the intensified, or you'll have the same things we have in English, more or less, reflexive, the pale, you've got all of those. But when I look in this book, and I look at the verbal form of this word, I got to go to the right page now. Adjective, adjective, verb. All right. Under the Hebrew forms we have here, obviously the call, as I said, which can be a simple action. It can be simple, or it can be in the future. The niffle, you'll see two different types of vowels for the verb forms, which I only put two, but there's actually many more. So the call, the niffle, the PL, I'm looking at all the forms here, the pual, the hifil, the hithpale, and I think that's it. The hithpale, you've got, imperative, infinitive, future, and participle. What does that do to our word? Let me give you an idea. So if I just take the PL, and I'm going to read you their portions, just like the Strong's has portions of a verse. It's not the full verse, so I'm only reading you portions. But in the PL, infinitive, and we're looking at this word that is being translated holy, consecrate, sanctify. You get the idea. So just in this one area, PL, the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Remember, it's all the same Hebrew word, but somehow this is what we ended up with in English. Make Aaron's garments to consecrate him, to hallow them, to minister unto me. These are all verses in Exodus. Be probably more helpful if we look at it together, so you can see that just in Exodus you have it is inconsistent in the translator's use, and I would say I understand why. Sometimes I don't get it. Here I actually understand why. Turn to Exodus 20, and let's look at the 8th verse. And the 8th verse says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. All right? And this is, I'm just using the PL and the infinitive. We've got, as I rattle off so many more, we could do the imperative. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. So that's the first one. Remember, it's being translated. This word, kadosh, kadesh, is being translated holy. If you turn in same book, Exodus, but go to 28, and I'm really just going to kill this so you can see the problem is not just one thing, it's multiple things. 28 and verse 3, and thou shalt speak unto all that are wise-hearted, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom, that they may make Aaron's garments to consecrate him. It's the same Hebrew word. So we have holy, consecrate, and then in 29:1, you're going to have the same Hebrew word being translated as hallow. And this is the thing that thou shalt do unto them to hallow them. Now, why didn't they just say consecrate, 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 or holy, 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 right? But there's several, that's why I said to you, it's impossible to treat this subject in 1 hour. It's impossible to even treat this subject and have it make sense until you put all of these pieces of information out, which help first to get in our minds that our language has kind of messed us up. Because I understand if you have an adjective or if you have a verb, let's use a verbal form. And the verbal form obviously is an action, right? So verb, it's an action. You would not be getting the same meaning of the word if it was an adjective. The adjective is going to be describing something about, usually about a noun in the sentence. So here, right away, the first thing I see is I see a problem with how to approach understanding this word in the Hebrew. Forget about the English. We'll deal with the English later because the English is like, it's 5 layers later. The first thing to deal with is, what do we do with this Hebrew word? And how should we understand it? Because this is where it gets fun. No one will say this, but when you begin to look at these words properly, you realize that maybe they are not, our English version is not adequately conveying the meaning of this word and is being confused many times with another Hebrew word, Nazir. Nazir, we get our you read in the Bible where it says he was a Nazirite, took a Nazirite vow. Didn't cut his hair, doesn't drink strong alcohol or whatever it is but that Nazir is to be dedicated or consecrated. That would really be our English word for his purpose. There was no other reason to use the word Nazir than someone who is Nazir unto the Lord, which makes this word kadosh or kadesh, it makes me have to stop and think, I'm clear about Nazir, the Nazirite vow. I'm clear about that. That makes it, that individual has been, let's talk about Samson or any of these that were separated, they were set apart, and a vow was placed upon them that basically consecrated them to the Lord. And for their consecration as Nazir, they would not partake or do certain things that kept them from defiling themselves in the eyes of God. That would be the vow. So we'd be safe to say that something like consecration would be an adequate or equal. Where it becomes confusing, and this is what I want to show you. 29:1 uses the word hallow. 29:33, and they shall eat those things wherewith the atonement was made to consecrate and to sanctify them. Now, what do you do when those two words appear in the same sentence? And I know you're probably saying, well, maybe you're not saying it because you're not as nutty as I am, but maybe you're saying, well, what does the Hebrew say? What does it look like in the Hebrew? Wait for it, because I'm going to share this with you, and you're going to be like, okay, that's messed up. And I didn't do it, so it's one time that there's a mess up that I'm not responsible for. God? All right. I said we were looking at 29 and 33, which shared those two words in the same verse, correct? So let's take a look here. In 33, so the word that they're using to consecrate, le-kadesh, and sacred, kodesh. They're the same word. Well, the vowels and the lamed prefix, which the lamed prefix is making it to consecrate or to. So we have a problem. You can see right there if both words are equal, and I'm looking at them and they are equal, we have a problem in our understanding of these words and how they're being used in English. Does that make sense? Yes. Good, because then you can see why I'm saying this is one of those things that we're going to have to do a little digging, and you'll find there's some kind of crazy roads we're going to encounter. One of those crazy roads will be to kind of look at the use, where this occurs, and there are elements that as I'm putting this together, and I'm taking up my magnifying glass and I'm looking at all the small print, I'm now seeing that I'm differentiating between the same words that we just looked at, the same Hebrew words. For many times, this word kadosh, kadosh, will be used, and by the way, it's change the vowels a little bit and you get temple prostitute. And most people think, oh, but be careful about your understanding about the biblical understanding or the understanding of temple prostitutes in antiquity, which may not be what we would put into the modern frame of prostitution. And the Septuagint didn't think anything of this, and in some ways, some areas where we encounter that, and we do encounter that in the Bible. The Septuagint, in some places, where they distinguish between people who were dressed up to look like women of ill repute, like Tamar, for example, Judah's daughter, or daughter-in-law. She is not porne. But in other places in the Septuagint where people were described as temple prostitutes, they might be described as porne. She was described as kadesh. So it's not as easy as just saying, well, if you just separate the words out, you got to dig a little bit. So that's what I would like to do, and hence why I tried to start with explaining some language, even our English frame, which if I take you on the journey through tracing our English roots, even for the word holy, you're going to be pretty surprised to find that word will take you down some very interesting pathways, including the roots that lead you back to the H-E-I-L, those heilig, H-A-I-L-I-G, all of those words which, following down the pathway of looking at those words and examining them, leads you to one part understanding the development of our language, and the other part leads you to this word was rooted in the worship of the sun. And oh boy, here we go now, because I opened up another door that makes you think, well, how many roads is this going to take us on? A lot. That's why I said it's very complicated. And you can read something like the passage that I quoted out of 1 Peter 1:2, which is the sanctification through the Spirit, and that makes perfect sense. It's the Spirit of God the Holy Spirit of God that's doing this work, but not always. Because when Jesus talks about sanctify them, John 17, when he talks about that, he says something that will leave you and me with the understanding that until the eyes are open, and the Spirit of God has to open our eyes for us to hear the word, to desire to hear the word, right? That on its own is an act of the Spirit of God coming into us. But then when Jesus prays in his prayer, and he says, 17:17, sanctify them through thy truth, thy word is truth. Here's a question for the ages when he says sanctify them, which, by the way, he's talking to God the Father and using an imperative. Better take cover. Sanctify them through thy truth, thy word. Your logos is aletheia. Your logos is truth. Well, Christ is the logos, and you've got the living word and the written word. And the word was not yet, the New Testament was not yet written, so we have the Old Testament, which was the only testament at the time. So what exactly did Jesus mean by thy word is truth? Was he speaking of himself and saying he is the truth because he is the truth? Or the word declared, the word that was the rhema, that is the truth? Or the word that was the word that God spoke, that became the written word? Or is it all of them? I know I'm trying to confuse you right now, and I'm doing a good job by the looks on some of your faces. My point is, it is probably, I think, in all the subjects that I have dealt with, it is the most complex, and it's the most complex because of the language. And once you move into, we'll pick apart the words that I've been looking at here and we'll analyze them. The other thing we're going to want to do, though, is we're going to want to look at a couple of other Hebrew words that could have filled in some, as I explained, Nazir is one of them. There are a few more words that will help us. And then there's also taking this word and putting it beside something that is the antithesis. Kadosh, and the antithesis to it, which would be hallel, which is what is common or what might be profane. So what has been put aside or set apart, and that which is profane. I'm going to add one last layer. The last layer is this. As I'm analyzing these words, I'm seeing that in most places there is a pattern. The pattern has to do with God's presence. Whew. When we start putting all this together, it becomes clear that the translators actually did us a disservice, and I don't think they did it deliberately, by using so many different words, and they may be, let's split them into two groups, and they're cognates, not the two groups together, but in this word grouping, they're all cognates and cognates of each other, but they did us a disservice because we will never get from our English to glean what exactly this means. It's simple to say and read and say, God is holy. Of course God is holy. He is apart from himself. He is apart from us. He is not the same as us. But what should it mean when we come across words, for example, the word sanctify, sanctification, consecrate, and it cannot simply just mean when people say, yes, it's set apart for the exclusive use of the deity, but don't leave something out, which is set apart for the exclusive use of the deity as he deems or as he desires. And on the flip side, if that which was claimed by him as it's for him, get rid of the sense of holy purity, this type of bad type of thinking. But if it's something that he says, that's mine, then we need to be looking at do those items ever become profane again? And if they do, what happens to the kadosh that had been pronounced upon it? Is it kadosh because God pronounced it that way, and if it becomes profane or if it becomes used in a manner that is not specifically for Him, what does that do to what has been pronounced as set apart? Remember, God said He's a jealous God. He's not going to have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. With God, He says, with me, it's all or nothing. And these words, rightly divided, will help us understand by using the juxtaposition of holy and unholy, or holy and profane, from the Hebrew words. We'll get an even better understanding of why this study is necessary, and how, hopefully, I'm crossing all my fingers and toes, that this will actually open up a better understanding for us, because it's the subject that people stay away from. Holiness, unless you are in a holiness church, where women do not wear pants, they don't wear makeup. I mean, they might wear makeup, actually. It doesn't help. We're pretty silly. Women are pretty silly. If we put stuff on our face, it doesn't help. You look like what you look like. I mean, men don't wear makeup. Well, some men wear makeup, but most men don't wear makeup, and they look the way they are, and that's the way they look, and that's that. We think we're putting tons of crap on our face, we're gonna look better. Looks good, doesn't it? All right. So now that you've got a little beauty lesson there on the side, what I'm trying to say is we really do need to strip this back and not have all the makeup on the surface. We need to get down to the bare brass of what exactly this means, and I think it's going to bring a lot of clarity to the word, the meaning, and the text that we will be dealing with. That's my prayer. So until then, I'm gonna leave you with some ideas, and hopefully you will be interested and you'll want to hear more. So right now, I need you to get on the telephone to make your reservations and your commitments. Get busy.